All right, let's open our Bibles tonight to 1 Chronicles chapter 11 as we continue our study on Wednesday nights through the historical books. Last week we began 1 Chronicles. We are going much quicker through the Chronicles than we did the Kings and Samuel for a couple of reasons. Chronicles is really a recapitulation of everything that you learn there. It covers the same years, the same background. You can remember maybe if you were with us that oftentimes you'll read those words, the rest of his acts, aren't they written in the chronicles of the books of the kings? And so that's where we are. We mentioned to you last week that oftentimes the Lord, by his Spirit, will give us a big focus of something and then kind of zoom in to give us a more clearly focused look, like in Genesis chapter 2, where all of creation is listed very quickly, and then God looks specifically at the creation of man. So Chronicles is an interesting book because it first focuses on the genealogy that will lead you to Jesus. Starts with Adam, goes to Jesus through King David. It focuses a lot on the covenants or the deals or the agreements that God made with man. It turns a lot of attention to the temple and worship. Ultimately, that God's ultimate desire is that the world would come to know him through the people that he had chosen, through the Jews. The emphasis of 1 Chronicles, as we'll see tonight, is primarily upon David. 2 Chronicles, kind of whatever follows after him. The most distinctive difference, or the most important, distinction between Chronicles and Kings is that Kings gives you the history and even the political climate. The Chronicles is more interested in what God thought of the spiritual tone and balance and health of the people. And so the Lord makes a clear distinction. And because of that, Chronicles is kind of God's report of the spiritual well-being or lack of it in the nation during the time that it was split, during the national divide. Kings is man's point of view, politically, historically. This is almost all God's interest in what he wants us to learn. So because of that, you won't find anything about the northern kingdom here, because it was a kingdom based on idolatry and rebellion, and it never amounted to much, and God put an end to it after 209 years. There is very little mention of Saul. We only read about his death last week as we ended chapter 10. You won't read about anything about David's sin with Bathsheba, although certainly that was a big part of the story, but where God forgives, he also forgets. The Jewish tradition says that Ezra wrote these books during the captivity in Babylon. Don't know. There are lots of indicators that these two books, along with the Kings and with Ezra and Nehemiah, made up one big volume, and that could have been so. I don't know. I do know the Lord wrote it. So last week we went through the chronology to David, through whom Jesus would come. And then in chapter 10 last week we ended with the death of Saul, because he didn't make much of a splash. He wasn't a spiritual leader. He was the people's choice. Tonight we are going to turn to the life of David and to his reign. From the time that when Saul died, he came to Hebron to rule the people. After 7.5 years, he moved to Jerusalem, and the entire nation stood with him, and God's glory was established. The story of David fills the rest of 1 Chronicles. So to the end of these chapters, next week we will be with David. Tonight, we're going to do chapters 11 through 20. Because they are overviews, we've asked you to read ahead. If you haven't, shame on you. No, I don't know. I'll recap them for you. You can go back and read them if you will. We're not going to read every verse. Chapter 11 and 12 is about David and his mighty men. Lots of lessons there. In chapters 13 through 16, David's relationship with the Ark of the Covenant and bringing it to Jerusalem as the center place of worship. In chapter 17, David and God's discussion about the temple and his desire to build a place for the Lord and what God would do for David instead. And then in chapters 18, 19, and 20, the battles that David fought to expand the kingdoms and protect the people. So like I said, the Chronicles kind of fills in the details from God's heart. And so if you put Kings and Chronicles together, you will come away with, I think, a broader view of what you need to know and what the Lord would want you to know. So let's start in verse 1, chapter 11. Then all of Israel came together to David at Hebron, and they said, "Indeed, we are your bone and your flesh, and also in times past, even when Saul was the king, you are the one who led Israel out and brought them in, And the Lord God said to you, you shall shepherd my people Israel and be ruler over my people Israel. Therefore, all of the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel according to the word of the Lord through Samuel. So David is becoming king. Now, if you go back to Samuel, you might remember that there were years where David, as a young man, ran from Saul. In fact, 7.5 years of running for your life. When Saul finally died, David thought, well, now I'll be king. But he wasn't, not really. He went to Hebron, where really, 1.5 tribes embraced him, while the rest of the nation was still following the Benjamites, if you will, and rebelling against God's choice of David. And that's all skipped over here. God goes right to David from Hebron, goes to Jerusalem, and becomes the king. But that's 15 years of time between when the Lord first picked David and when he would rule over the nation. Notice in verse 2 and in verse 2, and then in verse 3 as well, that the calling of David, according to the prophet Samuel years earlier, was pretty much twofold. David was a shepherd, but he was also a king. He was a king with the heart of a shepherd. You can read a lot of David's writings about the heart that he learned for the people by watching his father's sheep. That's 2/3, by the way, of Jesus' ministry. Jesus also came to be the high priest, to give his life, then to be our shepherd and our king. So David learned primarily what he was to do as a good king by watching over the flock. It's always good, I think, when people in ministry find their heart coming from the Lord to take care of the flock like sheep. In other words, to devote yourself and your life to them. A leader should certainly be willing, I think, to pay a price for the saints that he is serving. You might remember Jesus' discussion with Peter in John chapter 21, where he was restoring Peter to ministry after he had denied the Lord, and the Lord 3 times said to him, Peter, do you love me? And basically the response of the Lord each time was, then feed the lambs, shepherd the flock, take care of my people. The way you love the Lord is you serve others. When Isaiah wrote about Jesus' ministry, he wrote he would feed his flock like a shepherd, which was so against what was going on in those days. I mean, Ezekiel would be quoted, the Lord is saying, look, woe to the shepherds who feed themselves. They should be taking care of the flock. And so David was a man after God's own heart. He was a good shepherd. He was a good king. He was God's choice. Peter would write in his little book, 1 Peter, I think it's chapter 5, shepherd the flock of God which is among you. Do it as overseers. Don't do it by compulsion. Don't do it willingly. Don't do it for any kind of dishonest gain, but do it eagerly. Serve. And David was certainly that man that God had chosen. He was a man after God's own heart. It took years for him to come to a place where he was able to lead. It took years for the people to recognize it, but he stayed the course. So David and all of Israel, verse 4, went to Jerusalem, which is Jebus. It's where the Jebusites were the inhabitants of the land. But the inhabitants said to David, you're not going to come in here. Nevertheless, David took that stronghold of Zion, that's called the city of David, and made the pronouncement, whoever will attack the Jebusites first, he can be the chief and the captain of the army. And so Joab, the son of David's sister Zeruiah, went up first and became the chief. And so David's nephew, through his bravery, became the head of the army. He wasn't always a very godly man, but he did oversee this, and according to verse 8, he oversaw the renewal of Jerusalem that had been knocked down, much of it destroyed in these battles. And so we read in verse 8 that he surrounded the city from the Millo. The word Millo means landfill, to the surrounding areas. Joab repaired it, and David went on, and he became great, and the Lord of hosts, notice, was with him. Well, then beginning in verse 10 and down through about verse, 47, is that the end? We get a list of David's mighty men. Now, those are important guys for you to know if you've been reading the Old Testament history. These are folks that for the most part, joined David primarily out of rebellion against the government, against Saul. And David began to share with them his love for the Lord of Israel, for Jehovah. They began to know the Lord, and through most of David's examples were brought closer to the Lord. Some of these guys had been with David for 15 plus years, but now the Lord gives to us here and you can read about them in 2 Samuel, I think, verse 23 as well, the chapter 23. These are these men that when David came to power began to rule with David. It's a beautiful picture, if you look at it from a spiritual perspective, of Jesus gathering together you and I. He's gathering a people who are foreign to this world, who really don't fit in, if you will, who are now walking with Jesus in the days of his rejection, like David was rejected, and yet one day the Lord will come, and when he comes, we will rule and reign with him. That's kind of what happened to these mighty men that the Lord had brought to David. We have, beginning in verse 10 and down through the middle of the chapter, so a couple of stories of how these men fought for David. We get some names. There are groups of 3 rulers that seem to have others under them. Sometimes they seem to accomplish great things with, they killed hundreds in battle. They were just tough guys. But down in verse 15, there is one story which is told several times in the scriptures about an incident where it shows the love of David's men for David and their respect for him, even their bravery in battle. And there are 3 chiefs or rulers in his army. 2 of them here in this little story are named. One of them is not. But David had been raised in Bethlehem. And so as this battle transpired, if you will, David said to his troops kind of off the cuff, what I wouldn't give for some waters from the wells of Bethlehem. There's no better water than Bethlehem water. And while they were hiding in caves in this battle with the Philistines, 3 of his boys went out at night, went on a mission, snuck in across enemy lines, got to the well in Bethlehem, drew water out and brought it back to David, risked their very lives to get water for David. And David blew his mind. We read at the end of verse 18, nevertheless, David wouldn't drink of it. He poured it out before the Lord. And this is what he said, far be it from me, oh my God, that I should do this. Shall I drink the blood of these men who have put their lives in jeopardy for the very risk of their lives they brought to me? And so he wouldn't drink it. But these are the things that were done by these mighty men. And David recognized it. It's an interesting picture. Jesus was also born in Bethlehem. He's the water of life being poured out like water, I think we read there in Psalm 22. The one that if we believe in, we could be saved. We read in verse 20 of Abishai, who's also one of David's nephews, another son of his sisters. He was the chief of the second 3 overseers. And one of the things you read in this chapter about 3 times is David organized his leadership. There was a lot of thought given to who should be in charge. Some people are good at other things, and some people aren't very good at leadership. They're good at serving. And so everybody found a place with David and found their place of service, if you will. Verse 21 says of Abishai, of the 3, he was more honored than the other 2. Therefore, he became their captain. However, he didn't attain to the first 3. So there was a structure of responsibility, and as far as the word honored is, it just means a place of service. So, and then we get to verse 22 where we read this fellow Benaiah. He was the chief among the 30, and we read about him that he was the son of a valiant man. He had done many great deeds, and he killed 2 lion-like heroes of Moab. Also, he had gone down and killed a lion in the midst of a pit on a snowy day, and he killed an Egyptian, a man of great heights. He was 5 cubits tall, 90 inches. In the Egyptian's hand there was a spear like a weaver's beam. He went down to him with a staff, wrestled the spear out of his hand, and killed him with his own spear. So David had some tough guys around him. He had a gang, I guess. I love verse 22, though. Here's the Lord giving us insight into what's going on. And his description of this fellow is, he went down into a pit to kill a lion on a snowy day. I like that. That the Lord not only remembers your work, but in the conditions you had to serve him. Yeah, it was a snowy day. There was a lion. And the Lord takes note when we serve him under less than ideal conditions. You go to church and it was raining. You go to the baptism, there's clouds outside. We've sat a lot outside for a long time doing studies. It's been hot. It's been uncomfortable. The Lord takes note, I'm sure of that as well. So if you read down from verse 26 down, all you'll get is these wonderful names of David's mighty men. A couple of you can mark that we will know a lot about as you go back to the Kings. In verse 27, there's a guy named Asael. He is also another nephew, another boy of David's sister. And in verse 41, you probably recognize the name of Uriah the Hittite. Isn't that interesting? That Bathsheba's husband was one of David's mighty men, a guy that he would have been extremely close to. Chapter 12. And these were the men who came to David when he was in Ziklag, while he was a fugitive from Saul, the son of Kish. These were among the mighty men, the helpers in war, who came armed with bows, with using both their right hand and their left. They were ambidextrous in hurling stones, shooting arrows. They were Benjamites from Saul's family, his brethren. If you remember when you were going through 1 Samuel, I think it's chapter 22, David for a time went to hide from Saul in the enemy's territory. It wasn't his best move. He did a lot of things there that he probably regretted, but the Lord was with him even there, and it was this place called Ziklag. It had been given to him. The fellow in charge of the Philistines thought that David had defected and really had given him this place as a place of sanctuary, if you will. But even there, the Lord brought a lot of folks to David. And it's an interesting picture because the future for David looked pretty bleak. They had a promise from God, but that was about it. So when you look at these guys' names, you think, gosh, these guys joined a losing cause. I mean, on paper, they had nowhere to go. There was no open doors. There was no future. There's no brightness. And yet they were somehow convinced that God was with this young man on the run who had very little to offer them other than a promise from a God that they couldn't see. And I'm encouraged by that because, if you can see God's provision, and then David was a good leader, that he supported these men, and they came to know the Lord through David's own example. You remember when they trapped Saul, or they had Saul in a cave, and the boys said, "This is the Lord, man. He brought him to you so you can kill him. And if you don't want to, we will." And David had to teach them that you couldn't lay your hand on God's anointed. You remember? And he taught them the ways of the Lord in a way that only David could. So this chapter lists the growing support David got from those who were with him and were on the run with him, if you will. There's a couple of, I think, lessons that you don't want to miss in this chapter. Those who came to David, first of all, came from all of Israel. They came from every direction. In other words, though the north was gone and the south had survived it, those who came to him came from every tribe. And they were moved to join him because they saw that the Lord was with David. They were enemies, but they didn't stay enemies. In fact, if you read verse 22 here, you'll read, "For at that time they came to David day by day to help him until there was a great army like the army of God." But they came from every direction to be David's helpers. In Hebron, verse 38, 39, and verse 40, every tribe was represented. In fact, 3,000 of Saul's own people, his greatest enemy for years, joined the army, committed themselves to David. You can read about it in verse 1 and 2 and verse 29 or so. And all of them were used by God to accomplish God's will of making David the king, just as, verse 23 says, the prophet said so. Samuel told him that back in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel. The other thing, verse 8, if you look chapter 12 here, verse 8, it says, now David says, whoever attacks, I jumped back one chapter. Verse 8, it says this, some of the Gadites joined David at the stronghold in the wilderness. They were mighty men of valor, men trained for battle, who could carry a shield and a spear, whose faces looked like the faces of lions. Good-looking guys. And they were as swift as the gazelle on the mountaintops. What a great description of these guys. Courageous men. We read about them in verse 14. These were with the sons of Gad, captains of the army. The least were 100, the greatest were over 1,000. These were the ones who would cross the Jordan in the first month, or literally during flood season, when it had overflowed its banks. And they put to fight all those in the valleys to the east and to the west. So these guys were special forces kind of guys, tough guys, aggressive guys. I just love the description in verse 8. They look like lions' faces. David, when he saw these people coming to him more and more as they came, we are told in verse 16, as he saw them coming, he said in verse 17 to them, "If you have come peaceably to me to help me, my heart will be united with you. But if you betray me to my enemies, since there's no wrong in my hands, may the Lord of our fathers look and bring judgments." And so the Spirit came upon Amaziah. He was the captain of the priests, and he made a commitment that everyone would stay with David, that they wanted peace, that they knew God was with him, and so David received them, and they became a part of his army. So the mighty men of David, 2 chapters to just kind of show you where did all of his support come from, how did the Lord raise them up. It took a long time, 15 years for some of this staff to be a part of David's life. In chapter 13, 14, 15, and 16, easier to remember when you can block them together, we get to follow God's dealing, or David's dealing with the Ark of the Covenant. Now, you remember that this wooden box overlaid with gold had been built by Moses years earlier at the direction of the Lord in the wilderness, because that it was going to be that place where God's glory was going to be amongst the people, almost a symbol of God's presence among them. If you read, I think it's Exodus 25, there is a description and the details and the purpose of the ark. Well, the ark had either been with or not with the people for many generations, but it always represented God's presence with them. It was a reminder of something they couldn't see. During their fightings with the Philistines at a time when they were very far from the Lord, the children of Israel during the time of the judges decided that it would probably be all right to carry that ark into battle kind of as an amulet. It no longer represented God's presence. That they had forgotten a long time ago. It just kind of stood for something that was religious, that had power at some point. And so they carried this thing into battle thinking, oh, we're going to whoop these guys because we got the ark. And instead, they got taken out, and the Philistines took the ark and took it away from them, and Israel kind of went home with its tail between its legs. But the Lord also has a responsibility to make himself known when his people won't, and so he made sure that ark was a bummer to everyone that lived in the Philistine cities. In fact, let's just say they got sick. That's putting it mildly, but let's just say they got sick. They got so sick as they carted it around towns that they finally just said, we got to get rid of this thing. Smart, some guys, before we all die, we're going to get rid of it. And so they devised a plan. They said, if the God of the Jews is doing this to us, then let's prove this. Let's put him on a cart and have the cart pulled by nursing cattle that would have instincts to come back to their young. And let's just kind of hit them down the road. And, hey, look, if they run all the way to Israel, then we'll know that it was their God, and we're glad to get rid of him. And if not, if we're all just superstitious, then we'll find out. And, we've just had some bad luck. And so they did what they explained. The cows ran off, and they kept going, crossed the border, got to a place called Beth-Shemesh, where many died because now the Jews came, the ones who should have known this was God's presence. And they began to look into the ark, and they weren't supposed to be that close to a holy God. They were sinful. No way to get that close to God without some help. And so they would leave it there in the fellow's name. His name was Abinadab in Kirjath-Jearim. It would stay there for 100 years. No one would bother with it. Saul didn't want any part of that. The nation under Saul's leadership surely didn't worship. Well, now it's David's turn, and David wants to follow the Lord. And he knows and he remembers that that's the place of worship, and they haven't had a national place of worship in forever. And so when you get to chapter 13, beginning in verse 1, David consulted with the captains of the thousands and hundreds. In fact, he talked to every leader, it seems. Then he talked to all of Israel, and he said to them, if it seems good to you, and it is of the Lord our God, let's send out to our brethren everywhere, whoever are left in the land of Israel, with them the priests and the Levites who are in their cities and their common lands. Let's gather them together, and let's go bring the ark of the Lord of God back to us. We've not inquired of it since the days of Saul. And everyone said, that's a good idea. Now, there's been a lot of criticism, if you read Bible commentators anyway, that David probably shouldn't bother to check with the people, that as a leader he should really have just kind of sought the Lord. I don't know what to say about that. There were a lot of people who thought David made a mistake in taking this survey, but the king wanted to do the right thing, I think. He wanted to spiritually lead. He didn't want to have to mandate this thing, and it didn't seem to be necessary. It was a good idea. The problem was no one bothered to ask the Lord, how do they move that thing? Because in the last 100 years, the only experience they had was a nice new cart that the Philistines had used to send it back. And so everyone, beginning in verse 5, gathered together, and they headed over to Kirjath-Jearim. And this was the home of Abinadab, and they wanted to get the ark. But they never checked out with the Lord as to how, like I said, to move it. You can read in Numbers, I think chapter 4, verse 15. Numbers 4:15, that's right. How they were supposed to move this thing. And it had everything to do with the representation of God's presence, man's sinfulness, and the way man would approach God through the priests and through holiness. And it was a lesson that they needed to learn that obviously we do as well. So they show up with lots of music, much planning. It's a great idea, verse 9. And when they came to the threshing floor, as they had loaded this thing up and everybody was singing, there's a fella, Uzzah, who had put his hand out to steady the ark, for the stock of the oxen had stumbled, and God's anger was aroused against this man. He struck him because he put his hand on the ark, and he died there before the Lord. So great planning, great music, great idea. Everyone voted yes. They went out. They did what they thought they were going to do, and on some rocky ground, the ark gets bounced around. Some guy, in his effort to help, stops it. And boy, then this happens. Never forget the Lord's holy presence in our midst is not something we can take for granted. He's holy, we're not. So imagine David. He felt embarrassed, angry, fearful. He had come to do the right thing in the wrong way. He assumed that any way would have been good because it's a good thing. And that just doesn't work. There's no way that we can do that. So we read in verse 11 that David became angry because of the Lord's outbreak against Uzzah. Therefore, the name of that place is called Perez Uzzah, or against Uzzah, until this day. David was afraid. He was angry and he was afraid. You read it there in 2 verses. How can I bring the ark of God to me? So he decided he wasn't going to move it. He instead left it in the house of this fellow named Obed-Edom, who was a Gittite, and the ark of God remained in that family for the next 3 months, and the Lord richly blessed this house and all that he had, for they had his presence now with him. So David, he does the wrong thing, but he blames God. How am I supposed to move this then? Well, that would have been a good question to ask a few hours earlier. God help us to be able to seek to do God's will in God's prescribed method. There are methods, that God will bless. For now, David abandons the idea. Let's just leave the presence of God and the plans I had for Jerusalem, just leave it here, dumps it off in this guy's house, who blesses him because the Lord is there, right, in his midst. I think for you and I, maybe sometimes the warning can be that we can be guilty of trying to do things for the Lord in worldly ways. Equate it to the Philistine ox cart, if you will, to accomplish God's work. Since we started building our buildings, because they're registered, with the city and their public records, we probably get 5 or 6 calls a month about people who want to take our project and go out and raise money, and we're going to serve the Lord. It's ridiculous, because that's the way the world works. And we just go, yeah, the Lord will pay for it. He's always taking care of us. Oh, brother, we can really add stuff to your coffers. No. Yeah, see you later. That's really not the way God works, right? We don't have to hype awareness or raise funds or motivate people with the wrong kind of promises. We just have to rely on the Lord. The Bible says, unless the Lord build the house, we're just spinning our wheels. We're just laboring in vain. And so I think it's the same kind of thing. David meant well, but David was not necessarily going to find God's best just going off on his own and trying to do things the way he thought that they should be done. And so, David was angry. He was fearful. He gave up. Let's not do this. Well, then you get to chapter 14, which is kind of an inset into the story, and it tells us that the king of Tyre, his name was Hiram, would oftentimes in the north send messengers down to David to say that he would help him build a house or a palace for David. And we read in verse 2 something interesting. It says that David knew that the Lord had established him as king, for his kingdom was being highly exalted for the sake of his people. People began to notice that God was doing something with David, and it brought him renown, which David interpreted as the Lord is establishing me. However he felt in chapter 13, this encouraged him at least somewhat. We then read, which is just the opposite, verse 3, that David then took more wives in Jerusalem, begat more sons and daughters. Here are some of the names of his kids, and there's 13 of them just there. When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they went up to search David out, and David heard about it, went out against them, and they made a raid in the valley of Rephaim. And David said to the Lord, should I go fight? Will you deliver them into my hands? And the Lord said, go and fight. And so they fought at Baal Perazim, and David defeated them. And David said, God has broken through my enemies by my hand like a breakthrough of water. And so they called the place Baal Perazim, the breakthrough, the master of the breakthrough. And when they left their gods there, David gave a commandment to have them burned. And then the Philistines came back again, made another raid. And David said to the Lord, do we fight? And the Lord said, just don't go up this time before them, circle around behind them. And wait until you come to the front of the mulberry trees. And when you hear a rushing sound or a marching sound along the top of the trees, then go out to battle. The Lord will go before you to strike the camp. And David did as the Lord commanded. And they drove out the army of the Philistines from Gibeon as far as Gezer. And David's fame throughout all the lands grew, I guess. And the Lord brought the fear of him upon all of the nations. So, interesting picture. On the one hand, David was able to say, I know the Lord's called me. People recognize God's hand upon me, even though chapter 13 he was very discouraged, if you will. One sinful area of David's life, we mentioned it a lot, I think, when we were going through Samuel, was that David married a lot of women. God allowed it, didn't promote it, never turned out good. In fact, I don't think you'll find one example of someone with 2 wives in the Bible that was happy with it. I don't know if I could be happy with 2 wives. 1 is plenty. No, it's a good thing. 1, don't get me in trouble. But 13, 15, really? And unfortunately, he couldn't be the kind of father that he needed to be, and the kids didn't do very well. But, a lot of those examples come from the culture, and it brought David great grief. Here's 13 children, and there's a lot more. Beginning in verse 8 and then going to the end of the chapter, we get the story of 2 battles that David found himself in as he began to lead Israel against their enemy. And I think the 2 lessons, or the lessons that we should learn, at least from the 2 stories, is probably this. Whenever God brings you to a place of battle, make sure that you check with him, because he's going to direct you as to how to find victory. I think it ties to the chapter before. David didn't pray. He didn't seek the Lord. He didn't get the Numbers chapter 4, right? He didn't find out how to do it, and so things got bad. Doesn't mean God wasn't with him, but he had a lot to learn. And if you look at these 2 very short kind of reports of these 2 attacks and these 2, battles, if you will, each time David went and asked the Lord what to do, he didn't presume he knew, he asked. And when he was specifically told, he specifically acted upon what God's direction was. David didn't say, oh, Lord, I have a plan, please bless it, like we sometimes do. No, he was listening to what God had to say. So the first time, Lord, should we go fight? Yes, you'll win. And he did. Second time, Lord, should we fight like we did last time? No. I got a better idea this time. We're going to have timing and subterfuge, and you're going to have to hide in the bushes, and you're going to have to wait for my signal. All right, we can do that too. And it brought deliverance. It brought victory. Why? Because he was listening to what God had to say. And that requires us being in fellowship with God, having a nearness to the Lord. Notice in verse 16 these words, David did as God commanded, and because he did, he found victory and fame, and the Lord brought fear upon all of the nations because of David's leadership. How we need to seek the Lord and not presume upon him, and learn to pray, because he didn't do that in chapter 13, but he learned to do it here in some of his battles. So in chapter 15, notice David built houses for himself, prepared a place for the ark, pitched a tent outside for it, and then said, all right, let's go get the ark. But notice what he says in verse 2 this time. No one may carry the ark except for the Levites. The Lord has chosen them to carry the ark of the Lord and to minister before him. And David got all of Israel together to bring up the ark, and he assembled all of the priests from Aaron's family and the Kohathites in particular, and he went out to do the same work he started to do in chapter 13, except now he went with some insight. In fact, if you flip ahead to verse 13, David said to the priests, for before you did not do it the first time, the Lord your God broke out against us because we did not consult him about the proper order. And verse 15, and so the children of the Levites bore the ark on their shoulders by the poles as Moses had commanded them according to the word of the Lord. There's the key verses. We didn't do it in the proper way, but we're going to do it the right way. Before, in chapter 13, David blamed God. Well, what are you doing to me? I'm here to try to do good work, and you're not blessing me. Now he blames himself, and he points the finger at the priests as well. Well, look, know this. Good intentions cannot cover up disobedience. Good intentions don't help. We mean well. Yeah, but how about obeying? It's better than sacrifice. And he does. So, again, notice in verse 1 and 2, David again invites the nation. He doesn't take direction from them. He follows the Lord's direction. And verse 16, then David spoke to the leaders of the Levites to appoint their brethren to be the singers, to accompany them with instruments of music and stringed instruments and harps and cymbals by raising the voice with resounding joy. So David placed great emphasis on worship and the gifts that some were given to exercise that place of worship. They brought out the whole band. If you look at verse 22, it says that this fellow who led the worship was an instructor in charge of the music because he was very skillful. I pointed that out to you because not all of us can sing. We sound good together, but not all of us can sing. Now, the Lord is tone deaf. He just looks at the heart, but I'm not. Isn't it good that God raises up people that can carry a note and know how to play? And there's a difference. One aids in worship, the other distracts from worship. If someone's like a cat in the back row, the Lord might enjoy it because of your heart. I'm distracted. So David not only went about doing things the Lord's way, but he also looked for those who had gifts in the areas that they needed. And so he'll mention Asaph in verse 17 as an overseer. He'll mention the ranks of the different worship leaders. They had different responsibility. And the result in verse 25 was that they gathered everyone together and they came to get the ark with joy. And so verse 26 tells us that and so it was when God helped the Levites who bore the ark. They offered 7 bulls and rams, and David was clothed with a robe of fine linen. He wore, a common man's clothes, if you will, as were all of the Levites who were bearing the ark. The singers came along, the music master with his singers. David wore a linen ephod. Throughout all of Israel, they brought up the Ark of the Covenant with shouting, with the sound of a horn and trumpets and cymbals, making music with stringed instruments and harps. And it happened as the ark of the Lord came to the city of David, that Michal, who was Saul's daughter, happened to be David's wife, looked through a window and saw David whirling and playing music, and she just despised him in her heart. And so David did things the Lord's way. He had great joy. So did everyone else. There was a joyful kind of return, if you will, to Jerusalem. The only person not singing was his wife, his first wife. He was wife. He married her in 2 Samuel 6, I believe. And she didn't like the fact, according to 2 Samuel, that David looked like a commoner. He just joined with the people, just humble, loving the Lord. Her complaint to David was, you shouldn't have done that. And David said, look, I was dancing to the Lord, man. How can you criticize me? And so we are told that him and Michal did not have physical relationship after that matter. She never had children. And eventually she would leave David for another man and continue her way into idolatry. But needless to say, David learned this lesson. And I think chapter 14 is in the middle there. David learned that if he obeyed the Lord, he will do things right. He went to get the priests who, the Kohathites especially through Aaron, were the ones that were supposed to carry the ark. Because look, it's the priests that provided a way for sinful man to come before a holy God. Jesus would ultimately be our great high priest. Chapter 16, we're going to make it. I know we are. The ark is now set. So they brought the ark of the Lord, set it into the midst of the tabernacle David had erected. They began to offer burnt offerings, peace offerings to the Lord. And when David had finished, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord. He had distributed to everyone in Israel, both man and woman, a loaf of bread, a piece of meat, a cake of raisins. Everybody got dinner. And he appointed some of the Levites to just minister before the ark of the Lord, to commemorate, to be thankful, to praise the Lord. And then again, you get the names of those who are regularly serving. In fact, if you read down through verse 37, I believe, it tells us that Asaph and some of his fellows, they worked every day in ministry at the ark regularly as the day's work would be required. So they were full-time guys just standing there in fellowship with God and serving him. Beginning in verse 7, and finally the Lord's presence is in the midst of the people again. Beginning in verse 7, David then delivers this psalm. You can read it. We're not going to read all through it. It is almost the same as Psalm 105. The rest of them are kind of gathered from a couple of different places. Psalm, I think 106 as well is in there a little bit. But needless to say, it is a psalm about worship. It's just God is so good. God provides all of our needs. Every time God says something, he does what he promises. You can depend on his word, if you will. He has chosen us to be his people. And then ultimately, God would like the world to know through us that he's the Lord. So we read in verse 8, for example, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord and call upon his name." And then he says, "Make known his deeds among the people, and sing to him psalms, talk of all of his wondrous works." It really is a calling of the Lord, both to Israel and today to the church. If the church doesn't talk about Jesus, who's going to do that? And today, more than ever, I think we need to be talking more, not less. So, interesting. We get to verse 37, and we read, "And so he left Asaph and his brothers there to serve regularly, and Obed-Edom with his 68 brethren to be gatekeepers, and Zadok was a priest, and so were his brethren. They stood before the tabernacle at the high place that was at Gibeon to offer sacrifices regularly morning and evening, according to all that was written in the law." And on it goes, and they just kind of define some of the worship leaders and their names and the gatekeepers. And then all of the people, verse 43, they went home that day of the dedication, and David returned to bless his own house. It's interesting to me as you get to the end of this chapter that you don't get the name of David's Secretary of State or his treasurer. You only get the names of people that are carrying out spiritual things, which is interesting. He mentions all the others, but he goes, yeah, this guy did that, but not by name. It's kind of like all we're driven by the one idea that in verse 41, just to give thanks to the Lord for his mercy that endures forever. Aren't we glad for that? Chapter 17 is a exact verse-by-verse repeat of 2 Samuel chapter 7. It's the exact copy of that chapter. And it is important because this is the story of the covenant that God made with David. And I think it's so important that the Lord gives it to us twice in the Bible, word for word, because as this ark became part of the worship life of Israel, God's presence, David, sitting in a palace, thought, if I could just build the Lord a nice palace. He's out there in a tent, for crying out loud. It's not always such nice weather. And so I'd like to put him, in a better place, that befits the God that we serve. And so verse 1, David, dwelling in his tent, said to Nathan the prophet, "Look, I'm living in a cedar house. The Ark of the Covenant of the Lord is sitting under tent curtains." Without really saying anything else, Nathan the prophet said, "Look, just do everything that's in your heart. I'm sure the Lord will be with you." And then he went home, and the Lord said to his prophet, "You go back and tell David these things. You shall not build me a house to dwell in, for I have not dwelt in the house for a long time, since I've been with Israel to this day. I've gone from tent to tent, from tabernacle to tabernacle. Wherever I was moved with you, I went with you. Have I ever talked to you a word to all of the judges, or to commanded you to shepherd my people? Have you built me a house? I don't need a house." So David's heart was right. Nathan the prophet was a bit presumptuous. It sounded like a great idea to him, so he said, "All right." But remember, a lot of these lessons are seek the Lord, do things what he tells you. The Lord said to Nathan, "You're going to have to go back and tell David you are wrong. I don't want him to build me a house. I don't need him to build me a house." In fact, in this account, 3 times the Lord will mention the house of David will be the vessel through whom God will bring salvation to the world. And so the Lord said to Nathan, "I've never needed any house. I've just been with my people wherever they've gone. I certainly don't need a house of cedar." If you mark in the margin, or if you take notes in Exodus chapter 20, beginning in verse 22, the Lord gives a description of the kind of altar that he will accept. And if you go read there, chapter 20, I think, verse 22, it says that if you're going to build a place for me to worship, I want it to be made out of earth. I don't want you to carve on it so people go, "Oh, that's a beautiful altar." I don't want you to raise it up so high that the people can look up the skirts of the priests. I just want a place where when you come, the only thing you remember is me, not the place of worship. So David's desire was not in line with God's will, I guess, from the saints of worship, but the Lord had other plans for David. God isn't interested in luring people to him by the way a building looks. I'm glad we have a new place to worship, and when the sanctuary gets done, I think it'll be far more suited to service. I guarantee it won't be fancy, because nobody likes fancy, but we like to, be able to worship God as the Lord has allowed us to. And so I think it's people over, or function over a facility, if you will. And so the Lord begins then in verse 7 to talk to David through the prophet that God had a bigger plan. In fact, David was going to be the family through whom the Messiah would come. Now he starts by saying in verse 7, "I took you out from being a little shepherd boy, from following the sheep, and I've already raised you now to be the ruler over all of Israel. I've been with you. I've cut off your enemies. I've made your name great. I've appointed you a place. I've protected you, and I will continue to subdue your enemies before you. And I tell you that the Lord will build," verse 10, "you a house. And when your days are fulfilled and you go to be with your fathers, I will set up those after you, your sons. I will establish their kingdoms. He shall build me a house," talking of Solomon. "He shall establish his throne. I will be his father. He shall be my son. I will not take my mercy away from him as I took it away from him who was before you, from Saul. I will establish him in my house and in my kingdom forever. his throne shall be established forever. And so God made this promise of an eternal descendancy that David understood correctly was a promise of a Messiah that was coming. David, you started off kind of a nobody. And look at the somebody that I've made you, and I'm not done yet. I'm going to do far greater things for you than that. So when the king heard all these words, verse 16, he went in to set before the Lord, and he just shook his head. He couldn't believe what God was saying. He said, Lord, I don't know what to say. I don't know who I am that you've brought me this far. I'm small in the eyes of the world. I'm your servant, and yet you've raised me up to this, and now you're promising me an eternity and a descendancy that will continue on forever. And he says in verse 18 something very interesting. He said, I don't know what to say. What more can I say? David was the greatest poet of his day. He had lots to say. Look at the Psalms. He kept talking. But he realized, verse 19, that he didn't deserve any of this. And so he was amazed at God's goodness. He can only thank the Lord. And I think it is in verse 20, where are we at here? Verse 27. Now you have been pleased to bless the house of your servant, that I might continue with you forever, for you have blessed it, Lord, and it shall be blessed forever. The best thing David could do when all is said and done was to believe it. You blessed me? All right, I'm going to be blessed. Amazing. And isn't that interesting? I find that so often in pastors and in churches, pastors are prone to try to tell people what they ought to do for the Lord. I learned from Pastor Chuck years ago. He used to say to us young guys who wanted to be in ministry, look, if you're going to be a pastor, tell the people what God has done for them. Everything else will go downhill. That understanding will move their hearts to the point where they'll serve because they want to serve God. You can't really lean on, you know what you should be doing for the Lord after all he's done for you. And Chuck, because it's just so wrong. And David did the same thing. He wanted to do something for the Lord. The Lord said, no, let me tell you what I've done for you. And as a result, he's like, here's a guy, he's now sold out for the rest of his life because of that which God has done for him. Well, then we get to chapter 18, 19, 20, our last three chapters. I'm going to do it in 5 minutes. Watch this. No, I'll be all right. With all of the blessings of God and the promises of God, you would think David's life might have been easier. It was hardly easy. There were tribulations all of his life, much of them coming from his enemies. And so in chapter 18, 19, and 20, there are these broad strokes with occasional details to give us exact pictures of David's battles. And the theme of these three chapters, I think, is verse 6. Look at verse 6 of chapter 18, where it says, Then when David put garrisons in Syria of Damascus, and the Syrians became David's servants and brought tributes. And then you read these, so the Lord preserved David wherever he went. Down in verse 13, he also put garrisons in Edom. All the Edomites became David's servants. And you read again, and the Lord preserved David wherever he went. And so chapter 18, verse 1 and 2, the Philistines came to fight, and God preserved David. And the Moabites were run out of the land, and God preserved David. In verses 3 through 11, the king of Zobah came out against him. The Edomites in verse 12, the Ammonites and the Syrians in chapters 19 and 20. David did something interesting. You read it in verse 3. He set up garrisons. It was really the command posts as the land extended their reach, and the growth was unprecedented. And Israel was as glorious in David's day as it had ever been, or really will be until the Lord returns. With every bit of conquest, verse 11, David just saved up whatever he was able to gather from the people he overthrew, and he set the money aside for the house of God. That's what he was interested in being a part of. Verse 14 through 17, you get some of David's administration team. His oversight, if you will, and especially those in the military and those in the worship of God. Chapter 19 is a story, verse 1. It happened at that time that Nadash, the king of the people of Ammon, died. His son came to reign in his place, and David said, I want to show kindness to Hanun, who was Nadash's son, because his father had been kind to me. So David sent some messengers to comfort him concerning his father. And when they came to him in the land of Ammon, some of the princes of Ammon said to Hanun the son, verse 3, do you really think David really honors your father because he sent comforts to you? Did his servants not come to you to search and to overthrow and just to spy out the land? So they they gave bad information. And so Hanun took David's servants, he shaved them and cut off their garments in the middle so that their butts hang out. Pretty bad, isn't it? But it gets worse. Verse 5 says this, and so they went and they told David, and David went out to meet them or sent someone to meet them. He said, don't be ashamed. Just don't come home till your beards grow back. And I'm thinking, and get your clothes fixed as well. But there's something about those beards, right? The honor of the man was his beard. So they stayed in Jericho until they're, okay, so in any event, David tried to be kind. He was misread. David instead, verse 6, went after these guys because he had been offended, got troops. The Ammonites hired some troops to try to fight David. They didn't do very well. The war is fought beginning in verse 16. The battle is won decisively. And the alliance between the Ammonites and the Syrians at that time was broken, verse 19, as a result of this war. Chapter 20, and I told you we're going to make it. Look, only 8 verses, and I'm not going to read them. This short chapter focuses on Israel's war with 2 perennial enemies, the Ammonites and the Philistines. Verse 1, though, is important. It says, it was in the spring of this year, at the time that kings go to battle, that Joab led out the armed forces and ravaged the country of the people of the Ammonites and came and besieged Rabbah. But David stayed at home in Jerusalem as Joab was defeating the Ammonites and overthrowing their city. This was the battle and the time that David stumbled with Bathsheba. You can write 2 Samuel, I think, chapter 11 in the margin. He should have went to battle. He was coasting. You know how sometimes, you get victory and so you just go, I think I'll take a break. It's not a good thing because the devil doesn't take any breaks. So he doesn't go to battle. He should have been fighting. You can't live on yesterday's victories. The enemy is ever roaring like a lion. And so David would find, at least in this chapter, at this time, that the downfall with Bathsheba that would bring great grief to him, his family, the nation, and everyone involved. Verse 4 through 8 talks about the battle with the giants, the Philistine giants, members of the Goliath family from Gath, and these guys were just beat up. Notice verse 6, yet there was war in Gath with a man of great stature. He had 24 fingers and toes, 6 on each hand, 6 on each foot. This is a crazy-looking guy. He was a giant. He defied Israel. David's brother killed him, and so the fall of the Philistines kind of going forward. Lots to remember. Next week we will finish 1 Chronicles. Will you read ahead, please, so we don't have to wait for you? Skip all of the names, and we'll get to the lessons. And then I think we're going to do 5 weeks in 2 Chronicles, and then we're going to start the book of Revelation for the next 18 months if the Lord tarries. So, are you ready for that? Father, we thank you that tonight as we sit together in this new facility that you've given us, we're so thankful for your provision. We pray that we would use it well to bring honor to your name, that, Lord, we would come here just to lift our hands and lift our voices and acknowledge who you are. And Father, tonight as we kind of cruise through these chapters and really sought to take them to heart and to learn the things that you would teach us, we pray that we might learn truly, since these are your reports of the spiritual well-being, the good turns and that were made by those who love you, that we'll learn from David not to just presume that you'll like whatever we do, but that part of our relationship with you is finding out what you want and then doing it, being obedient to the Lord. That you said obeying was better than sacrifice. So I know that to you there's great premium, not placed on the big sacrifices we make, but on our willingness to do the things as you say. I always think about that at baptism. It seems such a silly thing to grab someone and put their head underwater and call that serving the Lord. But what we understand about baptism, of dying to ourselves and being buried in our in our old life and rising to with power in our lives, you said you would be pleased. And so such a simple act, and yet obedience brings your blessing. And God, that we might really learn that tonight, that we might remember what you said, that David went out on his own, presuming he knew, found out later that he should have been doing things your way, and not in the proper order, but according to the word. And when things got better, you blessed. You delivered in battle. You turned their lives to that place that you wanted them to be. You made your directions clear. You watched over your people. And even when David failed and struggled, you were always there to lift him up and to move him forward. And so, Lord, thank you that your grace is sufficient for us. And tonight we stand before you clean and whole because of your Son. There's no charge in heaven against us, no record of wrongs, no ledger of sin or failure. We're cleansed by the blood of your Son. And Lord, for that we worship you, for your mercy endures forever.